Have you ever struggled to know how to express your faith in the face of modern day American culture? Have you ever wanted to take a stand on some important issue based on your beliefs, but you were afraid of the backlash? Have you ever struggled with playing by the rules of the game when the rules go against everything that you believe in? How do you thrive in a culture where the rules and the norms are stacked against you? If someone tells you that they are never intimidated about talking about biblical ethics and biblical morals in the face of a modern day American culture, then they're either self-delusional or they're lying. It's hard. How do you make it in the world that we are quickly becoming? Post-Christian, secularized, humanistic, polytheistic. How do you live in that world and still maintain your Christian beliefs? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Ellis Orozco and welcome to my channel, a place where we think out loud about the Bible and how its teachings have an impact on our lives. If that sounds interesting to you, then be sure to hit the subscribe button and check back regularly. Okay, my thesis is this. In America today, we live in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. Now, the agenda of any culture is always to turn you into it. Culture values conformity above all else. It knows instinctively that conformity is essential for its own survival. Culture changes only slowly and with a tremendous amount of pain and pushback. So as the American culture becomes increasingly polytheistic and increasingly aggressive, is there any help the Bible can give us in coping, surviving, and thriving? The answer, as it turns out, is yes. In fact, there is a wealth of material in the Old Testament that tells the story of a very similar situation and how the biblical characters handled that situation. I am speaking of the biblical characters of the exile, the Babylonian exile in the Old Testament, namely Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Esther, Mordecai, Nehemiah, the writings of Ezekiel, and portions of the writings of Jeremiah and Isaiah. These biblical characters are part of the Babylonian exile experience for the Hebrew people. Through no choice of their own, they were forced to live in the Babylonian culture, which was, in fact, a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. So here's what I want to accomplish with this series. I want us to glean from Scripture some strategies for thriving in that culture, a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. And here's how I want to do it. First, I want to establish the striking similarities between the ancient Babylonian culture and modern-day American culture. And in so doing, I will show each of those cultures to be basically polytheistic with an aggressive agenda. Then I want to study the biblical characters and the biblical stories, the biblical prophecies that come to us from that time period in an attempt to understand how the Hebrew people not only survived, but thrived under those very difficult circumstances. Finally, I want to glean some critical strategies that teach us how not only to live, but also to thrive in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. Now, I can't do all of that in one lesson. So this is going to be a 5-part series. And here's what I want to cover in part 1, this lesson. First, I want to introduce you to the basic thesis of this series. I've already done some of that. And then I want to define the terms I'm using so that we are sure we're all on the same page. And then finally, I want to clarify the governing biblical theological principle for how we engage our culture. And then in part 2, I will describe the ancient Babylonian culture and compare it to modern day American culture. And I will identify a few critical core characteristics of that culture, the polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. And then finally, in the last 3 sessions, sessions 3, 4, and 5, I'll begin to define or identify the strategies used by the biblical characters like Daniel and Esther to thrive in their culture while maintaining the essence of their belief system, of their faith. So let's begin by understanding the thesis and defining some of the terms in the thesis. Let me repeat the thesis. So what I'm saying is, not unlike the ancient Hebrew people exiled to Babylon, American Christians live in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. So let me define and clarify the 4 key terms in that thesis. The first is the term Babylonians. What do I mean when I say Babylon, Babylonians, Babylonian Empire? What am I talking about? I'm talking about the historical group of people who lived in the area known as Mesopotamia in the ancient world, starting around 2000 BC to about 500 BC, so about 1500 years. The Babylonian people, a group of people, lived in that area which is one of the most ancient areas of the world. Many scholars believe much of what we know as civilization came out of that area of the world. So for about 1,500 years, they lived there. I'm going to talk a lot more about them, but for now, just understand that when I say Babylonians or Babylon or the Babylonian Empire, I'm talking about a specific group of people in a specific place and time in history. Now, the second term I use a lot is polytheistic. It's a Greek word or Greek root word that comes from two Greek words, the word poly, which means many, and the word theo, which means God. So polytheistic means many gods. The fact that the Babylonian Empire was a polytheistic culture is pretty much a foregone conclusion. I don't know a single historian of any substance who would disagree with that. Although at the very end of their history, the rise of Zoroastrianism began to change that a little bit. Many believe Zoroastrianism is actually monotheistic, but that's neither here nor there because the Babylonian Empire, for most of its history, was absolutely polytheistic. But my contention is that American culture is also polytheistic and has been since its inception. So I may have to do a little bit more work on convincing you of that one. The third term I use is the term culture. And I want us to be on the same page with culture. I don't want to assume that you know what that is. I'm going to tell you what I mean when I say culture. What I mean is a combination of the habits, mores, moral codes, ethics, etiquette, norms, likes, dislikes, religious beliefs, proclivities, shared stories, shared perceived enemies, shared history, organizational systems, music, poetry, and so much more of a particular group of people. This is the 1,000 things that make a group of people who they are, what they believe in, all of that. That's culture. And the last term I use is aggressive agenda. So what I mean by that is that although a culture may have a number of segmented agendas and tribal concerns, but when I use the word aggressive agenda, what I'm referring to is the overarching drive of any culture to promote and establish conformity among its members. That drive is always there in any culture, but the intensity of that drive varies. So here's what I mean. The agenda of any culture is always to turn you into it. You're going to hear me say that a lot. Culture values conformity above all else. It knows instinctively that conformity is essential for its own survival. Culture changes only slowly and with a tremendous amount of pain and pushback. Nonconformists within a culture are usually shut down, marginalized, and eventually eliminated. There's actually a well-defined process for how a culture changes over time. When a new idea that goes against the well-established norms of the culture is introduced, it automatically goes through a long, arduous, and usually violent process of acceptance. In the first phase, the oddballs or the nonconformists introducing this new idea are marginalized, they're ostracized, they're often eliminated, sometimes violently. They become martyrs for this new idea and inspire another generation, a second wave of advocates, if you will, who in turn, again, are ostracized and marginalized, but this time with a little less intensity. And they inspire another generation who, again, are ostracized and marginalized with less intensity. And the process repeats itself until enough people in the culture accept the new idea and it reaches this tipping point and then becomes acceptable. And then it becomes a part of the culture. This process historically has taken several generations to play out. But today, that timeline has been compressed with the advances of technology, which have basically democratized or pluralized both access and influence, access to new ideas, and the amount of people who can influence it immediately. The process is basically the same, but the timeline has been accelerated. So it is to some degree the exponential growth of technology that has cranked up the intensity of this process and therefore the aggressiveness of the culture. The culture is aggressive because it uses every tool available in its arsenal of tools to try to change you into it. Think about all the things it uses, all media platforms. Think about books, television, streaming, social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all of them, news agencies, movies, and on I could go. It uses the educational system, parenting strategies, food, sex, marketing, anything it can find to promote its values and turn you into it. This describes 6th century BC Babylon. It also describes modern day America. Now let me pause here to clarify something, because it could start to sound like I'm setting up American culture to be 100% evil and to be the enemy that is to be fought against at all costs. And that's not what I'm trying to do. That's not what I want to do at all. For one, I don't believe that to be true any more than I think 6th century BC Babylon was 100% evil and the enemy to be fought against. And in fact, we're going to learn that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Esther, Nehemiah certainly didn't think that way about Babylon either. There is a basic biblical theological idea that is important for this discussion. And I want to introduce it here at the beginning of our discussion because it will shape our entire discussion and our entire perspective on this particular subject. And it is the biblical theological idea of Christian engagement for the common good. Christian engagement for the common good. It is the natural ramification of Jesus' command to love God and love neighbor as yourself. Or if you're rather, it is the public manifestation of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, what we call the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or as Paul reminds us in Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, where he writes, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always to be gentle toward everyone. And centuries before Jesus or Paul, Jeremiah said the same thing. Writing to the exiles in Babylon, Jeremiah gives them this sage advice in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, where he writes, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord Yahweh for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Here we found the foundation for Christian engagement in the American culture for the common good. So how do we do that? Well, the way I want to frame this is that I want us to think about the Christian's posture in the public square, in the culture. That's the way I'm going to frame it. I'm not here with policy advice or recommendations. I'm not here with political positions to recommend or defend. I'm not trying to advocate for any political stance or party. None of that. None of that. What I'd like for us to think about is our posture, the way we carry ourselves in the current cultural moment, our stance in the current time. You know, St. Augustine, in his very important work, City of God, reminds us that the citizen of the city of God will always find himself thrown into a situation of being a resident alien in some outpost of what he calls the city of the earthly city, the world. In one sense, every Christian carries a green card because we are resident aliens in the United States. And Augustine says that there's something about that stance, that posture, that reality of being a resident alien that characterizes a Christian in every age and in every generation. Citizens of the heavenly city, he tells us, and now I'm quoting him, lead what we may call a life of captivity in this earthly city as if in a foreign land. It's a very strong language, and it's a very ancient language. He just described the Hebrew people in Babylon. It's an ancient language that the church has inherited. And what comes from this recognition that citizens of the city of God are, in a sense, resident aliens is something akin to what public theologian James K. Smith calls a kind of calculated ambivalence. Smith says, and I quote, at times there'll be a certain looseness that is tempered then by evaluations of how we can collaborate for the common good. In other words, we hold loosely to this world even as we calculate how we can work for the common good of this world. In other words, if we are consumed by how terrible things are going in America and you begin to speak and fight as if our eternal destiny depended on how things are going in America, then you are not living as a resident alien. By the same token, if you are not consistently asking yourself how you can engage the culture for its common good, how you can collaborate for the common good, then again, you're not living as a resident alien. The resident alien does what Jeremiah advised the Hebrew exiles to do. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 5, 6, and 7, it says this: build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. In other words, the resident alien cares deeply for the world and engages in the world, yet always with the understanding that he cannot forget that he is not of this world. He is of another world. Augustine again emphasized that the heavenly city is on a pilgrimage. And he says, we don't hesitate to obey the laws of the earthly city, by which those things which are designed for the support of this mortal life are regulated. On the contrary, we participate, we submit, we work alongside. And in fact, he says we do this especially so that we can live in harmony even with those who are on a pilgrimage to some other place. Isn't that amazing? We seek harmony and peace even with those who are on a pilgrimage to some other place. So it's not a question of whether we are resident aliens. It's a question of how. How do we live that out? How do we live out our resident alienhood, so to speak? And while the church has spent a lot of time and a lot of energy wrestling with what views we should hold or what positions we should advance, what battles we should fight, and we probably need to keep doing that, keep wrestling with that. But I worry sometimes that we've lost our way and we are sort of slouching towards irrelevance because we're digging in our heels in an irrational defensiveness against the culture. We're missing or forgetting something fundamental about the posture of being citizens of a heavenly city who are only on a pilgrimage in this earthly city. We are strangers just traveling through. We have to remember that to worship Christ as King, to proclaim Jesus as our King, which we do every day, or at the very least, I hope you do every Sunday, to proclaim Jesus as your King is to be a people with a kingdom-oriented stance, a kingdom that is not of this world, which sometimes I suggest would mean that it's going to make us look a little aloof or even disinterested. Or to quote Smith again, having a calculated ambivalence. But at other times, it's going to throw us right into the fray of what we need to be fighting for. So the posture of heavenly citizenship, I want to say, is a posture of uplifting the culture. Imagine that it means that we are a people who are tethered to hope by a coming king, our king. Or as Paul reminds us, that it's precisely those who have their citizenship in heaven who are called to shine like stars in the night sky. So we have to work on our posture. We need to put a couple of books on our head and walk around working on our posture in the public square, our stance, the way we approach this polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the Babylonian culture, what made it polytheistic, what made it aggressive, what was its agenda, and how does modern day America compare? Then in subsequent lessons, we're going to begin to look at those amazing biblical characters of that time period, Daniel, Esther, Jeremiah, and the rest. We will glean from their lives and their actions the strategies that we need in order to thrive in this culture. I hope you can come along the journey with me, and I pray that God will bless you as you do. I can't wait to see you next week.